Landlord had to pay big. I was 19 years old, and still learning how the world worked, when I rented a small one-bedroom duplex from a landlord who lived on the same property. Back then, property sounded like such a grand word. But really, it was just a modest patch of land with a beaten-up dirt driveway that split in two directions, one to my side of the duplex and the other up toward the landlord's larger house. She had a daughter who lived in the other half of the duplex, a bigger two-bedroom unit. And I later learned she had yet another daughter living somewhere far away in Hawaii. None of that mattered at first, or so I thought. I just needed a roof over my head, some privacy, and a place to call my own as I navigated the early part of adulthood. Little did I know what I was stumbling into. When I moved in, the arrangement seemed simple enough. Rent was due on the 10th of each month, and the utilities, electricity, gas, and water, were all on the landlord's single meter. She'd bill me somewhere around mid-month based on usage. I agreed, though I admit it felt a bit odd at first to rely on her to tally up my share. But she seemed confident in her system, and I was too young and inexperienced to question it. If that's how she'd always done it, I figured it was probably fine. Right. For about 6 months, everything went smoothly. My life was a mellow affair back then. I worked at a local diner, flipping burgers and restocking mustard bottles, earning enough to cover rent and put a little aside. Each morning I'd walk to work, or sometimes drive if the weather was lousy, and come home to my little sanctuary. It wasn't the greatest place in the world. There was a certain musty smell in the corners, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear the landlord's daughter vacuuming at odd hours. But it was mine. At 19, that felt like a monumental achievement. I had my own space, my own table, my own bed. Independence was the name of the game, and I treasured it. I remember the first time I actually interacted with the landlord face-to-face in a real conversation. She was out watering her garden on a Saturday afternoon, wearing bright pink gardening gloves and a wide-brimmed straw hat. She seemed pleasant enough, though a bit distant. I thanked her for renting the place to me, asked if there were any issues with how I'd parked my car, or if she needed something from me. She shook her head. "Just make sure you pay the rent on time," she said, leaning on the handle of her garden hoe, "and don't forget, I'll bill you for the utilities in the middle of the month." I remember nodding, trying to project an air of responsibility, like I had everything under control. I was determined not to be seen as some clueless kid. If anything, I wanted her to know I respected her property, and was grateful for the arrangement. My rent was due on the 10th, but I had gotten into the habit of paying on the first Wednesday of every month. The reason was simple. My paycheck arrived on the previous Friday, and I had my day off on Wednesday, so it was a perfect time to handle bills and errands. The landlord had never complained about this, which surprised me a bit. She had originally said the 10th, but I was paying early and, ironically, more consistently than she required. I figured that was a good thing. How could she be mad about getting the rent earlier than expected? But one particular month, this was about 7 months into my lease, things went haywire. It started innocently enough. That Wednesday, which landed on about the 5th or 6th of the month, I finished my diner shift, came home, and grabbed my checkbook. It was a drizzly afternoon, with cold wind rattling the old windows of my little duplex. I slipped on a coat and headed up the dirt driveway toward the landlord's house. Her place was bigger, a 2-story cottage-style home that looked quite charming from the outside. When I knocked on the door, there was no answer. That seemed strange because I could see a light on in the living room. Maybe she was busy, or had popped out for a moment. So I tried again an hour later. Still nothing. I could hear the faint sounds of a radio inside, so I was pretty sure someone was home. I tried again the next day, knocking firmly, calling out, "Hello, it's me, just here to drop off the rent." But again, no answer. This time, I decided to write out the check, slip it into an envelope, and push it through the mail slot in her door. I was used to paying her in person, but if she wouldn't answer, this was the next best method. I scribbled my name, the month, and rent payment on the envelope, just to be clear. Then I dropped it in. I felt a little uneasy. The landlord was usually pretty quick to answer the door, or at least shout through the window if she was busy. Now, It was like she was actively avoiding me. A day later, I drove home from my shift and noticed a folded paper stuck to my front door. The wind whipped around me as I climbed out of my car, so I hurried up to grab it before it blew away. It was a 24-hour notice to vacate due to non-payment of rent. I can still recall my utter shock standing there, reading and rereading the notice. The date was the 8th of the month. My rent wasn't even technically due until the 10th, and I'd already tried to pay early as usual. The memory of slipping that envelope under her door felt almost surreal. How could I be accused of non-payment when I'd already handed over a check? I scrambled for a logical explanation. Maybe there'd been a misunderstanding, or the envelope had gotten stuck somewhere. I tried calling her, knocked on her door 3 times that evening, left polite notes, but nothing. She never responded. My frustration brewed. It felt like I was in some bizarre game of hide and seek. I hated confrontation, but this was ridiculous. I'd paid her. Why was she ignoring me? The real trouble started the next day. The 9th, I woke to a cold gray sky and the promise of snow. The place I was renting wasn't insulated well, so I always relied on my gas heat to stay warm. But that morning I noticed the thermostat was stuck on a low reading, no matter how I fiddled with it. Then I tried flipping on a light in the kitchen. Nothing. No electricity. My heart dropped. That's when I realized she'd cut off my electricity and gas. The air in my little duplex was getting colder by the hour. It felt both literal and metaphorical, as though she were icing me out of her property entirely. At this point, I felt trapped. I was young, inexperienced with tenant-landlord disputes, and living alone. I tried calling the landlord one more time, and left a message, politely asking what was going on, why she was shutting everything off. Predictably, no response. As the snow started fluttering down that afternoon, I wrapped myself in a blanket, determined to find some help. I remembered a friend once mentioning legal aid in our city, an organization that couldn't always represent you in court, but they could give advice and make calls on your behalf. That seemed like my only hope. So I bundled up, hopped in my old sedan, and drove carefully through the slippery roads to the legal aid office downtown. It was a small building with peeling paint and a missing letter on the sign outside, but I was grateful to see a desk clerk who welcomed me in from the cold. I explained my situation. My landlord had posted a notice to vacate, refused to accept my rent payment, and cut off my electricity and gas. The clerk listened intently, took some notes, and within half an hour I was speaking to an attorney who offered me a seat and a cup of instant coffee from a little pot on the counter. I poured out my worries, step by step. The weird avoidance, the notice, the abrupt shut-off of utilities. He shook his head in growing disbelief. "That's definitely not legal," he said quietly, jotting things down. Then he asked if he could call my landlord on my behalf to see if this could be resolved without further drama. I agreed. Maybe she'd pick up for him. Maybe we could settle this with a simple conversation. Part of me still hoped there was just some bizarre misunderstanding. The attorney dialed her number on his office phone. I could hear her pick up on the other end. He began politely introducing himself. "Hello, ma'am. My name is so-and-so, and I'm an attorney with legal aid. I'm calling about your property." That's as far as he got. Suddenly, the landlord's voice erupted like a cannon shot. Though I couldn't make out every single word, I heard enough. She was screaming about how no government employee was going to tell her how to run her property, and she certainly didn't owe anyone an explanation for anything. I remember her exact phrase, "No government employee is going to tell me what to do." She hung up so forcefully that the attorney and I heard the click reverberate through the phone. He gently set the receiver down and looked at me with raised eyebrows. Then, he let out a sigh that turned into a wry smile. "Well, that was illuminating," he said. "We'll see what we can do." He made some notes, asked me for more details, and ended our session by telling me that he would file a complaint and a restraining order if necessary, because shutting off my gas heat in the middle of cold weather, especially during a snow, was considered a serious threat to my safety and well-being. I left the office feeling a mixture of dread and relief. On one hand, there was now a professional who knew about the situation and promised to act on my behalf. On the other, my landlord's hostility was unnerving. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding, apparently. She was determined to get rid of me, and I still hadn't the faintest idea why. As I drove back, the snow thickened, transforming the streets into a slippery, white labyrinth. The property's dirt driveway was half hidden under fresh powder, but I managed to carefully maneuver the car onto my side of the split. That's when I noticed flashing lights reflecting off the snow. There was a sheriff's car, parked up near the landlord's house. My heart thumped. I inched forward, parking as near to my place as I could without skidding into a ditch. Then I saw the deputy in uniform, stepping around the side of the landlord's home. Apparently, legal aid had worked fast. They'd filed some sort of emergency injunction or restraining order to protect me from being deprived of heat, especially in a snowstorm. The sheriff was probably there to inform the landlord that she needed to turn my utilities back on or face legal consequences. My nerves jangled, but I also felt a flicker of gratitude that someone was taking this seriously. I didn't dare approach them, so I ducked into my duplex, noticing that the temperature inside was dropping dangerously. I turned on the faucet to check the water, and a shiver ran down my spine when no water came out. She'd shut that off too. An even bigger health hazard. I grabbed my coat and stayed alert, half wondering if the sheriff or the landlord might knock on my door, but everything stayed quiet on my side. I caught a glimpse of the deputy's car pulling away about 20 minutes later, but I heard no knock, no voice calling for me. The next couple of days were a blur of back and forth communication. The landlord continued to avoid me, but after the sheriff's visit, my water and electricity mysteriously came back on. The gas too, though it sputtered for a bit. I kept in touch with the legal aid attorney, who told me that the landlord had refused to speak to him again, and had insisted on getting her own attorney because she didn't want any government stooge telling her what to do. Now, to be clear, legal aid attorneys are not some monolithic part of the government. Many are privately funded or volunteer-based. But evidently, she lumped them all under one big category: goofed employees. She wanted nothing to do with them. In the weeks that followed, everything snowballed into a legal showdown. The attorney helped me file the necessary paperwork to protect my rights. Since I'd technically been given an eviction notice that was invalid, the date was before my rent was even due. The landlord was in hot water. Worse for her, she'd illegally cut off my utilities in the dead of winter, which is a huge violation. According to local tenant laws, you can't use utility shutoffs as a way to force someone out. The legal system really doesn't like that. Meanwhile, I eventually discovered the reason behind her bizarre behavior. Her other daughter was moving back from Hawaii, and she wanted the one-bedroom duplex, my unit, for her. Instead of giving me a standard 30-day notice to vacate, something she was well within her rights to do if she didn't want to renew my lease, she decided to bully me out early. Maybe she thought I was too naive or timid to fight back. Maybe she figured she could just ignore me, and I'd quietly slink away. Who knows? What's certain is that she shot herself in the foot with her underhanded approach. The driveway, ironically, became part of the legal drama. Because of the restraining order and some other conditions the legal aid team pushed through, she couldn't block access to my side. If I ever felt unsafe or threatened, law enforcement had the right to intervene. That meant she essentially couldn't step onto that shared driveway in a way that might infringe on my space. Since it was a single dirt lane that split near the middle, any attempt to barricade or block me was strictly prohibited. I found out from the sheriff that my landlord fumed about this incessantly, raging that she couldn't use the main stretch of driveway or do anything on the shared portion for fear of violating the restraining order. She was livid, so ironically, while I remained on the property, she was the one who felt restricted in her movements, all because she'd chosen to cut off my heat and electricity in the dead of winter. Poetic justice, some might say. When the dust settled, we went through a formal mediation process that the landlord refused to attend personally. She sent an attorney, someone who looked harried and annoyed at having to deal with this fiasco. And in that setting, the extent of her wrongdoings became crystal clear. She had illegally evicted me prior to my due date, refused to accept my rent payment, shut off essential utilities, and created a hazardous situation. Each of those points carried legal ramifications. With the help of the legal aid attorney, I was able to negotiate a settlement. I'd get 45 days to find a new place and move out, which gave me ample time to plan. On top of that, She had to pay me 3 months' worth of rent and utilities, plus a lump sum of $5,000 for damages. That was an enormous amount of money for me in those days. Like an entire year of rent, easily. Even now, that'd be a decent chunk of change. I remember leaving that mediation feeling simultaneously shocked and relieved. I was stunned that the law could be so firmly on my side. Until then, I'd always felt powerless as a tenant. I was relieved I wouldn't have to scramble to find a new place within 24 hours. 45 days was more than enough to pack up my few belongings and scout out somewhere else to live, and at $5,000. At 19 it felt like a windfall. More money than I'd ever had in my checking account at one time. I used part of it to secure a new apartment, with a landlord who ended up being lovely, and the rest went to a modest car upgrade that I desperately needed. I even put a little away in savings. As for the landlord, I heard bits and pieces through the grapevine that she was furious about the outcome, claiming the system was rigged against her. She tried whining about government overreach, conveniently ignoring the fact that all she'd had to do was give me a legitimate 30-day notice without shutting off my utilities. That would have cost her $0 and a lot less stress. Instead, she was out several $1,000s, plus legal fees, and had to watch me, someone she plainly disliked, live on her property for another month and a half, with no recourse to force me out. And ironically, she couldn't even walk freely on her own driveway without risking a violation of the restraining order. In that final month and a half, I never saw her face to face again. She stayed holed up in her big house, presumably venting to her daughter about the injustice of it all. Her other daughter, the one who was presumably coming from Hawaii, never made an appearance during that time. Maybe she delayed her move until I was out. Or maybe she found a different arrangement altogether. No idea. The landlord never apologized, never acknowledged any wrongdoing. I suppose that's her prerogative, but it certainly didn't endear her to anyone. Meanwhile, I took my time packing up and quietly celebrated my small victory. I was cautious, of course, because I didn't want to provoke her into doing something drastic, yet part of me was genuinely proud that I'd stood up for myself. Sometimes, people think tenants have no power, or that young renters can be pushed around, but the law exists for a reason, and the help from legal aid was a godsend. They knew the regulations, the precedents, and the ways to protect me from retaliatory actions. On the day I finally moved out, I remember gazing around the little duplex. It had been my first real attempt at living independently, and it held so many memories. Slow mornings, sipping coffee, the nights I heard raccoons scratching at the back door, the silly wallpaper in the kitchen that I'd briefly tried to spruce up with homemade decorations. Even though the experience had turned ugly, I felt a pang of nostalgia. Maybe that's just how memories work. You can resent a place but still feel attached to the life you lived there. I ended up standing in the bare living room for a moment, taking it all in out. The landlord was nowhere to be seen. There was no dramatic confrontation or final exchange, no handshake, no goodbye, just me, a quiet wind, and an empty space that I'd once considered home. Later I found out, through a friend who knew the sheriff, that the landlord had a bit of a reputation for pushing boundaries with her tenants. She'd apparently been warned multiple times about cutting utilities or locking tenants out without proper notice. My situation was the biggest fiasco yet, culminating in a forced settlement that cost her a small fortune. I ended up learning that the landlord's behavior toward me wasn't all that unusual in the grand scheme of things. She'd pressed her luck with previous tenants, too. My run-in just happened to be the time she finally suffered significant legal and financial consequences. Apparently, after I moved out, she continued to clash with legal aid attorneys whenever she attempted to evict or strong-arm another renter. Word traveled fast in those circles. She tried to salvage her reputation by spinning tales about government overreach, but the facts spoke loudly. You can't illegally shut off someone's utilities, especially in winter. If you do, you'd better be prepared to open your wallet. As for me, after those final 45 days, I loaded up my little car with all my belongings, which mostly consisted of secondhand furniture, a few battered cardboard boxes of clothes, and personal odds and ends. I felt waves of relief as I carefully drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror at the landlord's property, half buried in early spring mud. The dirt driveway that had become such a point of contention curved away behind me, disappearing into the trees. Her house looked quiet and a bit run down against the gray sky. It struck me as sad in a way, almost as though the place were reflecting the landlord's sour outlook on life. My new apartment was part of a small complex on the other side of town, miles away from that weird shared driveway fiasco. The building was old but well maintained by a kindly older couple. They lived in one of the units themselves, and took real pride in making sure everything worked properly. When I arrived with my meager caravan of thrift store furniture, they greeted me in the parking lot, introduced themselves, and even helped me lug a few boxes up the stairs. I wanted to cry, both from exhaustion and from the shock of basic human kindness, something that had been so absent in my previous living situation. That moment crystallized for me that not every landlord is predatory. Some genuinely value their tenants and appreciate the stability of good people paying rent on time. It was a stark contrast to the tension I'd been living under for months. In the days that followed, I used the settlement money carefully. Some went to first and last month's rent, plus a security deposit at this new place. Another portion helped replace my aging sedan, whose radiator was on its last legs. After that, I had enough left to stash in my bank account, an emergency cushion for the first time in my life. It felt like an enormous weight lifted off my shoulders. No longer was I living from paycheck to paycheck, with no safety net. I could breathe a little easier, plan for unexpected car repairs, or take a sick day at work without panicking about missing rent. Each morning in that new place, I'd wake up to quiet halls, reliable heat, and peace of mind. Snow still lined the streets, but I no longer worried about shivering in the dark if my landlord decided on a whim to cut the power. Instead, I sipped my coffee, looked out the window at the couple who owned the building, and felt something akin to gratitude. Life was no longer overshadowed by the threat of eviction or a landlord's wrath. I'd cross paths with them in the hallway, and we'd exchange friendly small talk. Sometimes they'd knock on my door to let me know a handyman was coming by, or to offer leftover cookies from a holiday party. It was all so normal, and that normalcy was something I didn't realize I'd been missing until I finally had it again. But despite moving on, I did occasionally think back to the fiasco with my old landlord. Sometimes I chuckled at the absurdities, like the sheriff's car blocking her from accessing her own driveway, or the memory of the legal aid lawyer calmly warning her over the phone, only to have her erupt in that screeching tirade about how no guffed employee would tell her what to do. Other times, I caught myself feeling a bit uneasy, remembering how helpless I'd felt on those cold days without heat or electricity. It was like a bruise on my psyche, a reminder of just how quickly someone with a little power can yank away your sense of security. Yet, that experience also taught me the importance of knowing your rights. I was just a naive teenager, fresh out of my parents' home, with no idea about landlord-tenant laws. If I'd been too timid to seek help, she might have succeeded in running me off with no compensation, no proper notice, and no recourse. It might have ruined me financially. Instead, the moment I stepped into the legal aid office, everything changed. Having an attorney put pressure on her forced her hand, and revealed that she'd been lying about me not paying rent. In the end, her refusal to handle the situation ethically cost her dearly, and it gave me the chance to find a better situation. Occasionally, people who heard about my story would ask, "Don't you feel bad taking all that money?" Or, "What if the landlord was just in a tight spot?" My answer was always firm. No, I didn't feel bad, because what she did was heartless and illegal. She put my health and safety at risk. She had every legal avenue available to her if she truly needed me out, like issuing a standard notice or even buying out my lease. Instead, she tried to take a shortcut that was both cruel and blatantly against the law. If she had simply said, "I need the unit for my daughter, so here's a 30-day notice," I'd have packed up my few possessions and left within the month. I might have grumbled a little, but I would have gone. She chose the nuclear option and unleashed a chain reaction that ultimately burned her. After I was settled in the new apartment, I continued working at the diner. My daily routine found a new, calmer rhythm. No more dreaded walks up a dirt path to slip my rent check through a mail slot. No more frantic calls to a landlord's silent phone. I felt the difference in my bones, a lightness that told me I was free of that constant undercurrent of dread. I actually saved enough over time to sign up for some community college classes at night, putting me on a path toward a better paying job. My new landlord was flexible about letting me park my car near the side entrance, so I could zoom off to campus after dinner shifts up. That small kindness made a huge difference. I wasn't racing across town, scrabbling for street parking, risking lateness. It let me keep my job, maintain my living situation, and still pursue an education. I sometimes recounted the old story to friends, particularly when they ran into rental problems of their own. I'd mention how crucial it was to document everything, from the day rent is slipped under the door to the day the lights are shut off, and how seeking proper legal support can swing the pendulum in your favor. Most folks raised their eyebrows, marveling at how my landlord had sabotaged herself so thoroughly. They also relished hearing about the day she was effectively barred from using her own driveway. There was a certain poetic justice to that image. Over the next few years, as I continued working, taking classes, and building a new life, I'd occasionally see the sheriff who'd been at the property that snowy day. He'd stop by the diner for a quick meal, sometimes taking his lunch break at the counter. I recognized him right away, though he didn't recognize me at first. When I reminded him of the shared driveway story, he chuckled. "Oh, that one," he said. "I remember your landlord cursing us out, complaining she couldn't even check her own mailbox without risking a lawsuit. She was a piece of work." He filled me in on the subsequent drama he'd heard. Apparently she tried to claim that she was the victim in front of a local judge, saying the tenant had it out for her. But by that point, the evidence was overwhelmingly against her. She dropped her claims when she realized they'd just dig her hole deeper. After all, there was proof of me trying to pay rent, plus her shutting off my utilities. The judge wasn't sympathetic to her crocodile tears. I never did see the landlord's daughter, who was supposed to move in from Hawaii. Maybe she arrived after I left. Or maybe the plan fell through. Part of me idly wondered if the daughter had any idea how much trouble her mother went through, trying to free up that one-bedroom duplex. The bizarre extremes of that fiasco might have been news even to her. But, in the end, it didn't matter. I was out of there. The landlord ended up paying me a hefty sum, and life moved on. As time passed, that saga gradually receded in my mind. Just another chapter in the story of my life. It became less a raw memory, and more of a bizarre anecdote, one I'd trot out at dinner parties, or when the topic of worst landlord experiences came up. People would gasp or laugh in disbelief at the outcome. She really had to pay you that much. You got to live there another 45 days while she basically couldn't use her own driveway. That is wild. And I'd grin a bit, remembering how, despite being young and naive, I'd managed to stand my ground with the help of legal aid and a dash of luck. In quieter moments, though, I reflected on the fact that the money I received, 3 months of rent, my utilities deposits, plus the $5,000, changed my trajectory. It wasn't a massive fortune, but at 19 it was transformative. It allowed me to choose a safer, more comfortable home. It freed me from the suffocating cycle of living paycheck to paycheck. I could actually breathe. Maybe treat myself to a small luxury now and then, and plan a bit more for the future. For a while, the entire ordeal felt almost like a dream, some improbable windfall that fell into my lap. But I never forgot that it came with a real cost. Days of panic, frozen nights, and feeling like my stability could vanish in a blink if I didn't fight for it. Years passed, and I grew older, moving through different apartments, different jobs, eventually landing in a decent career path. Each time I had to sign a new lease or handshake a new landlord, I remembered those lessons. Read the contract carefully, keep receipts of everything, know who to contact if things go sour. Some landlords were wonderful people, others were more aloof, but none were quite as brazen or unhinged as the one I dealt with at 19. In a way, she set a baseline for worst-case scenario, and nobody else even came close. I also came to appreciate how many good landlords exist, the kind who treat you with respect, fix maintenance issues promptly, and never break the law to get their way. After all, renting out a property is a business, and a good business owner values fair dealings. Sure, I stayed vigilant, but I also learned not to paint everyone with the same brush. The world is vast. Some folks are decent, others are unscrupulous. You live, learn, and move on. Despite everything, I never encountered my old landlord again. She was little more than a footnote in my life's timeline, albeit an eventful one. I heard rumors that she sold the property years later, perhaps to rid herself of the memory of losing a chunk of money and facing the glare of the law. By then, I was long gone, settling into a new place that offered stability and comfort. If she did sell, I hope the next owner maintained it more responsibly. The duplex itself wasn't in a bad location, and with some TLC, it could be a lovely little starter home for a young renter. Someone like I was, full of modest hopes and a need for an affordable space. Now, decades down the line, I'm well past that period in my life. A lot has changed since those days. I'm older, hopefully wiser, and when I look back at 19-year-old me, I feel a pang of tenderness for the girl who was terrified at the prospect of being kicked out into the snow. I'm proud of her for stepping up, finding help, and not letting herself be railroaded by a landlord who thought she could bully a clueless kid. If there's a moral to the story, it might be this: knowledge is power, and so is community support. If you're a tenant dealing with harassment or illegal eviction tactics, don't assume you have to fight it alone. Seek out your local legal aid or tenant advocacy group. Document every interaction, every attempt to pay, every utility shut off. At times, the law may move slowly, but it can still protect you if you know how to use it. And ironically, sometimes just standing your ground reveals that bullies crumble under legal scrutiny. In the end, the landlord learned a harsh lesson about playing games with someone's basic necessities, especially in a region that gets snowstorms. She wanted her daughter from Hawaii to move in swiftly, but instead of going through proper channels, she tried a shortcut, one that led straight to a legal meltdown. For me, it became a pivotal life experience. I discovered that even a naive 19-year-old can stand up for her rights, as long as she doesn't shy away from asking for help. I learned that paying the rent isn't just about handing over money on time, it's about abiding by mutual agreement that, when violated, can have real consequences. Sometimes I think about how things might have gone differently if I hadn't knocked on the landlord's door that chilly day. If I hadn't left that envelope with my check, would she have tried to claim I never attempted payment? Maybe I would have had no proof to protect me. Fortunately, I did exactly what I was supposed to do, and that turned out to be my saving grace. It's a small detail, but details can matter so much in these disputes. It's been so many years now that I only recall the basics of the legal case. But the memory of that morning, I stepped inside the legal aid office, my hands shaking, breath visible in the cold air, still stands out. I remember the attorney's calm tone, the phone call that ended with the landlord shouting, and the way he turned to me and said, "We're going to fry her age." In that moment, my fear melted into cautious hope. There are people out there who defend the rights of those who can't afford a big legal team, and sometimes they do it with a vigor that can disarm even the most blustering bullies. Looking back on my entire stay at that old duplex, I can't say I regretted moving there initially. At 19, any roof that wasn't my parents' place felt like a huge step toward independence. Yet that independence came with a test. A crash course in tenant law, negotiation, and self-advocacy. I wouldn't wish such a dramatic ordeal on anyone, but it shaped my willingness to stand up for myself in other areas of life. If you can face down someone threatening to lock you out in the snow, other challenges feel a bit more manageable by comparison. From time to time, I still smile about the image of the landlord fuming in her house while the sheriff's car blocked access, all because she tried to deprive me of heat in winter. There is a certain karmic elegance to it. She could have avoided that entire disaster by simply giving me 30 days notice, or coming to talk with me like an adult, but she picked malice over civility, and malice turned around to bite her harder than she ever imagined. In the ensuing decades, I suspect she might have told her version of the story, maybe spinning it into a yarn about an ungrateful tenant who tried to cheat her. That's okay. The paperwork, the checks, the calls to legal aid, and the settlement all tell the truth. She paid a lot more than she ever expected, and she couldn't even use her own driveway for weeks. And I walked away with money I used to improve my life, plus a lesson about never underestimating your legal protections. Nowadays, when friends or acquaintances mention trouble with a landlord, I always share my story, not to encourage them to be litigious or combative, but to remind them to know their rights and never assume they have to just take it. A landlord-tenant relationship should be balanced. There's give and take, but if one side breaks the law, especially in a way that endangers the health and safety of the tenant, there's recourse. Even if you're young, even if you think you can't afford an attorney, there are avenues for justice, and sometimes, Yes, it can be swift and financially painful for the perpetrator. In the end, I found a new home, gained some extra cash, and moved on with my life. The landlord was left with a hole in her bank account and a bruised ego. She'd acted under the assumption that I was powerless, and she gambled on scaring me into leaving without a fight. It's one thing to serve a legitimate notice, but quite another to pull the plug, literally, on essential utilities. Ultimately, the legal system handed her the bill for her arrogance, and she paid it in spades. I never spoke to her again after that. Never saw her face, or heard her voice. I don't even remember precisely what she looked like, or how her voice sounded when she wasn't screaming. All I remember now is the shape of her front door, the envelope slot I used, and the swirl of winter wind that day. I do know she eventually got her property back when I moved, but not without a hefty price tag. And from my perspective, that was justice served. When someone tries to push you around and you stand up for yourself, legally, calmly, and with the right support, it can flip the entire situation on its head. I was a 19-year-old kid, but I walked out of that chapter of my life with 45 days to move, fully funded deposits for my next place, 3 months of rent paid, all my utilities and fees covered, plus an extra $5,000. When you boil it down, this is what I learned. Document everything. Never be afraid to seek legal help. Even if you think you can't afford it, don't let someone with more perceived power bulldoze your rights. And remember, sometimes the best way to handle a bully is to make sure they have to answer to the law. That day, driving off with my car loaded, the wind in my hair, I glanced one last time in the rearview mirror. The old duplex and the landlord's house faded into the distance, the driveway fork still blanketed in snow. I felt no regret, only a sense of triumph mixed with relief. I was free to live my life without her looming over me, and I had the resources to do it comfortably. I hoped her daughter from Hawaii, if she ever arrived, found a warmer reception than I'd received. And if she didn't, well, maybe her mother would learn that playing by the rules is a lot cheaper and less chaotic than waging a petty war. The older I get, the more I realize how pivotal that experience was. It taught me about self-worth, resilience, and the importance of justice. It proved that even a scrappy 19-year-old diner waitress can stand up to someone with property and influence if she gets the right help. And the memory remains a testament to the power of a well-placed phone call to legal aid, a protective restraining order, and good old-fashioned tenant rights. So that's how it all ended. I never spoke to the landlord again. She never spoke to me. She lost a chunk of money. I gained a little nest egg, plus more time in peace to move on. Sometimes the good guys, or at least the ones in the right, really do get the last word.